Jurgen?
Muted.
Okay,
It's called Lobert.
thank you, Jurgen. As our guest speaker, he'll be teaching us about night photography. He's a Massachusetts-based fine art photographer and educator. So it's 10 p.m. his time. He was born and raised in Germany. He specializes in night photography, daytime long exposures, urban exploration, and infrared imagery. He's curated photography exhibits, and his artwork is in the permanent collection of the Art Complex Museum in Duxbury, Mass, and in private collections. He also organizes photo excursions, workshops, and tours, and he's an international lecturer, instructor, and competition judge, and teaches photography at the Griffin Museum of Photography outside Boston. He's a master member of the New England Camera Club Council and the founder and organizer of the Greater Boston Night Photographers Meetup Group. And I'd like to recommend that you all take a look, if you haven't already, at his superb website. It has lots of interesting photos and wonderful wealth of technical information. Plus, he has an interesting page layout he calls the flip card, where he'll make a mosaic of images. And if you tap the image, it flips over to tell you what it's about or offer you a link to dive into it in greater depth. It's really fascinating. And he also has discovered something himself called infralucent clouds, which are only visible in infrared. And some of his photos of those are quite wonderful. So he's lots of terrific technical recommendations on equipment and setups, and I strongly recommend his website. With that, I'll hand it over to Jurgen and Vern. If you would mute everybody except for yourself, Jurgen, and me, we will get going. Oh, Jurgen, how would you like to do Q&A? Would you like to just sort of say when you would like to open it up to questions?
So if you have any questions because something is unclear, by all means, do interrupt me and ask it right away. If you want to know, are you going to talk about white balance? Trust that I will at some point. And if I didn't, then you can ask at the end again.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, Vern. Eudice.
Vern, the meeting is recorded sign is still up.
You click, got it.
Yeah, well, it's not closing.
You click the.
It's easy. Okay, now
Okay.
or you're gonna go.
I'm online,
muted?
I believe, right?
Yeah, you're online. You're not sharing yet, but we can hear you. There we go.
All right. Thanks for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about night photography, the world at night. And this is an educational program, but I hope that I spiced it up with enough interesting images for you to get inspired about that. So I hopefully give you all of the tools that you need to get started. And there are always many ways of doing similar things. What I'm telling you about is just one of those ways, and it is a way that has proven to give you some really good images if you follow that advice. And then once you master that, you can stray and develop your own style, so to speak. Without further ado, let's get going. So why do we do night photography? Aside from the obvious, why not? Because we can. There are a few things that I believe makes night photography extra special. And one of them is that night photos are often very colorful. And my photos never use saturation. I rarely use vibrance. So what you see, an image like this, is really how it comes out of camera, more or less. And that is because the camera is optimized to record everything as it is. Human eyes are not optimized to see colors at night. We can see light and dark pretty well, but colors not so much. They're all kind of muted. And there's actually a very famous painter, Vincent van Gogh, who realized that. And he said, I often think that the night is more alive and more richly colored than the day. So he had a good perception there. Another reason is that because we use long exposures, we create smooth waters and we make people disappear. So many of the photos that we take appear very peaceful, and because there are no people in it, due to the long exposures, they also have an otherworldly character to them. And then we are recording time. Because it is dark, we are forced to take long exposures. That's when the clouds are starting to move and create those bands in the sky. Cars form very bright streaks in the streets, and the stars appear to move because the Earth keeps rotating during that time. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we smooth water out because of the long exposure. The water is averaged over time and becomes a mirror finish. But I think the most important aspect of night photography is that it is very transformational. So here I am on the clock tower in Boston, which is an elevated vantage point, always good. But if you look down on the city, it's kind of all gray and gray, kind of boring. There's nothing special about it, right? Now, if you come back at night, that is a very different view. Now you see that main artery going through Boston, with the Blue Sakim Bridge here. There's the Bunker Hill Memorial, and here's the Tobin Bridge and the harbor. And what is actually one of the busiest places in town, North End, with 100 restaurants, appears quite dark, which is interesting. And here's another example. I am underneath the Sakim Bridge, and that is the main I-93 highway bridge in Boston. And if you go there during the day, again, everything is gray and gray with gray water, nothing special about this place. It's kind of boring, right? But if you come back at night, it transforms into a spectacle of light and shadows and mixed colors. It's really quite beautiful and transforms that mundane look into something very special. And then night photography is relaxing. It's a very slow kind of photography. You set up your tripod, you put the camera on, then you figure out what your settings are, you compose, and once you press that shutter button, you wait for 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe an hour. And while you wait for those 40-minute start trails to finish, you can engage in a conversation with your fellow night photographers, or you can just start thinking very deeply about philosophy. And if you happen to fall asleep, then your start trail just gets a little longer, right? And then, of course, nighttime is when the stars, the moon, and the Milky Way come out. And that is something that motivates a lot of people to start night photography. Milky Way, moon, and so on is all what I call advanced night photography, astro landscape photography. So there is a separate talk about that. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. What is nighttime? When is nighttime? And if you look at Wikipedia, so there are no official definitions for that. The PSA doesn't have one. The NECCC, the New England Camera Club Council, doesn't have one. Wikipedia says photos taken between dusk and dawn. And then my question is, well, which dusk and which dawn? Because we happen to distinguish three of them. We have civil dust, nautical dust, and astronomical dust. So once the sun goes below the horizon, half an hour before, about half an hour later, so 20 minutes later, that's what we call the golden hour. And that's when civil twilight starts. So that's for about 30 minutes in our latitudes. The next 30 minutes is nautical twilight, and the time half of civil twilight into half of nautical twilight, that is called the blue hour. There's really no hard definition for that, but that's roughly the time frame for the blue hour. And the blue hour is called blue hour because of deeply blue skies. So it does not mean that everything in your photo is blue. If everything is blue, you just have the wrong white balance. But the skies are very deeply blue. And then after that comes astronomical twilight, and then eventually nighttime. And nighttime means the brightness no longer changes. And then, of course, you can predict that. There are certain apps. I use Luna SoCal, which is an Android-only app. Many other apps where you can see the exact timing of the twilights in the morning and in the evening, because in the morning, of course, everything repeats in reverse order, right? So you come out of night into astronomical twilight, then nautical, then civil twilight, and then you have sunrise. So for me, Jurgen's definition of night photography is, first of all, it happens outdoors, or at least shows the outdoors. And secondly, it's any photo taken between the civil twilights. I exclude the civil twilight because it's still very bright out. It's a beautiful time, beautiful colors and everything, but I don't count it as a night photo. And as a rule of thumb, once you get to 10, 15 seconds at ISO 100, that's what we call nighttime, right? So here's an example. This is civil twilight. That's about 20 minutes past sunset, and you can still see a little bit of orange glow in the sky where the sun was setting, especially in the clouds here. But the lights are starting to come on, and this is a good time to start shooting bright lights, because the bright lights in the bridge here don't contrast all that much with the sky, which is still fairly bright. Now, during nautical twilight, the sky is starting to get darker, and again, you still see a little brighter blue here where the sun is going down. But you also see that the contrast between the bright lights and the ambient is coming more extreme, and you have to make sure that you don't clip those highlights. And then after that comes astronomical twilight, where there is very little blue left in the sky. The stars come out very nicely. That's where you can shoot. Even the Milky Way is starting to show up. And that leads you into nighttime. And that is what we human eyes perceive to be black skies. And if you ever watched Star Trek or something like that, you know space is black, right? Now, the trick is that cameras always see a little more. That's why cameras never record a black sky. It's always dark gray and should be neutral gray unless the moon is out. And here's the Milky Way later at night. So let's start with a few technical aspects. First of all, safety. It's dark outside, so make sure you're safe. Don't stumble, don't fall, and make sure that you know where you're going. Use all of your senses, not just your eyes. So don't wear the headphones and your cool shades. Make sure that you are aware of yourself and your surroundings. My ethics motto is take only photos, leave only footprints. Don't do any stupid stuff. Don't do anything illegal. A little trespassing is okay, but don't cut any bolts or smash any windows, right? That's not cool. And consider that you're not alone. If you go out to shoot with somebody else, make sure that you are not in each other's photo. Make sure that you don't shine your light around and kill somebody else's photo. But you may also find people approaching you and asking you, what the heck are you doing there? And in most cases, it's just curiosity. And it's a good way of starting a conversation that, yes, you can do photography at night when there is no light. What you need in terms of equipment is a camera where you can control aperture, exposure time, ISO, and white balance manually. So a point and shoot is not going to do it. You have to have something where you can control those settings manually. With respect to lenses, you will probably find yourself more on the wide angle spectrum, although I do occasionally take my 200 millimeter out to shoot those industrial sites across the water. And then, of course, you need a tripod, and that needs to be something sturdy because your camera is recording time for 30 seconds, 4 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, or maybe even an hour for a start trail. So you don't want that camera to move, and a sturdy tripod is very useful. And because many cameras are still limited to 30 seconds maximum exposure time, you'll need some means of triggering something that goes on for 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 15 minutes. An intervalometer is the best solution for that, and you can buy those for $15, $20. A stupid timer will work too, and if you have a Bluetooth connection to your phone, there are many apps where you can trigger your camera and expose for as long as you want. Don't buy the original brand, the Nikon or Canon intervalometers. They cost $150. You can buy something that is completely identical in form, fit, and function and costs 1/10 of that. And other stuff that you need, spare batteries. Long exposures drain your battery much faster than short exposures. So I usually don't count my battery life in the number of photos that I can take. I count my battery life in the number of hours that I can shoot with it. And that's typically about 3 hours, but sometimes only 2.5 hours. So you want at least one spare battery with you. Practical clothing, I always wear hiking boots, for example, no matter where I go, no matter how hot it is outside. It's just a little bit of safety or security that I am wearing there. And take some liquids and maybe a snack, because you go out at 8 or 9 o'clock, you might find yourself at midnight, and the last time you ate something was 6 hours ago. So here's one early night photo that I took at the Kennedy Library in East Boston. And what I loved about this image is the strong leading lines, the stair steps going in, and then that round auditorium with the shadows on it. And the shadows are coming from a street light to the left, which is shining through the branches and projecting them onto the building. And then there's this beautiful glass cube in the back. So it's a really cool location there. Camera settings. The best advice I can give you is to learn to know to control your camera at night without having to look, which means you have to know how to change exposure time, aperture, ISO, and white balance. Those are the 4 settings that you're constantly going to be adjusting. And you can practice that at home, really. Take your camera, sit down on your living room couch, turn off the light, and start fiddling with the camera until you know it by heart, so that you don't need a flashlight to look at your camera, or you don't need to figure out where is that ISO setting, where is that white balance setting. So learn your camera. It's very important. And then turn off anything with the prefix auto. Auto exposure doesn't work, auto focus rarely works, and auto white balance, I guarantee you, will not work. There's another setting called long exposure noise reduction, and that is typically something that automatically kicks in once you get past a few seconds of exposure time. And what the camera does is, if you take a 1-minute photo, the camera closes the shutter afterwards and then takes another 1-minute photo to record the dark noise. And then it takes that noise photo and subtracts it from your original photo to give you a very clean, noise-free image. Now, you will learn that we're going to be shooting at ISO 100, low ISO, so there isn't much noise being created. And personally, if I take a 4-minute photo, I don't want to wait another 4 minutes before I can use the camera again. So I turn that off. Shoot in RAW format, very important, because night photos have very extreme dynamic ranges. You have some really, really bright lights and some really, really deep shadows. So you need to be able to recover highlights and recover shadows, and you cannot do that with a JPEG. So you really need to shoot in RAW format for that post-processing latitude. And once you get past 30 seconds, go into bulb mode, use your control or intervalometer, and start shooting, or use the built-in timers. And one other tip is to turn the brightness of your LCD down by 3 stops. That LCD is made for the bright sunlight so that you can see something. At night, they're too bright. First of all, they blind you. They blind your night vision, so bright. And secondly, photo might look properly exposed when in reality it is 3 stops underexposed. So by dialing down the brightness of that LCD, you get a much more realistic rendition of the photo that you just took. Then I very strongly recommend to turn on the highlight clipping indicator. I call them the blinkies, and the red, green, blue histogram, not just the white histogram, because that is only an average of the 3 colors. The red, green, blue histogram will show you if you are clipping individual colors, and we'll talk about that. So now let's talk about exposure. You might have heard of the exposure triangle, and I created my own version here. The way I drew it is different from what you usually find, because in practical terms, you can crank up exposure time, aperture, and ISO and blow out everything. The way I drew that triangle here is that you can maximize only 2, and then you have to minimize the 3rd parameter. And exposure time, of course, longer exposure times means you get more light. If you open the aperture, means you get more light. And if you crank up the ISO, that means you amplify the light more. So increasing these will give you a brighter image, basically. And the one parameter that we're going to minimize is the ISO. We're going to shoot at low ISO, somewhere around ISO 100. Your native ISO may be 64, it may be 200 on some cameras, but it's typically somewhere around ISO 100. And when I say we minimize that, that doesn't mean I never shoot at ISO 200, sometimes even 400, but you will not see me shooting regular night photos at ISO 800 or 1600 or so. I do that when I shoot the Milky Way, but not in the city. And then you choose the aperture, and you do that for creative purposes. Do you want a really shallow depth of field with f2.8, or do you want everything sharp from foreground to background with f11 and 16? And with that selected aperture, we can play with the exposure time. So if we increase the exposure time, that means we have to close the aperture. If we open the aperture, that decreases the exposure time. Where we want to be is right around here at long exposures. So that's what we're trying to do. And the reason why we shoot at ISO 100 or somewhere around there is there are a few reasons for that. First of all, as soon as you increase the ISO, you create more noise because ISO only amplifies the signal, but that's not just the bright light, it's also the noise. So here's a comparison of ISO 50. And if you look at the shadows of that puddle here, it's really smooth at ISO 50 and it's really noisy at ISO 6400. So we want to avoid that. That's one reason why we shoot at low ISO. And secondly, we want to force long exposures. So we want to shoot those cloud streaks and the star trails and the car trails. So we want to force that with a low ISO. Now, what can we shoot at night and where can we shoot at night? And the answer is just about anywhere. So here's another photo of that gray and gray Sakim Bridge. I encourage you to purposely go to places that you believe are fairly mundane, not very interesting during the day. At night, they might just turn into something completely different that is really, really beautiful. Here I'm shooting back at the city and TD Gardens, the event place is in the background there. And as a tip, if you have a waterfront somewhere, either the ocean or a river going through the city, that's always a good place to be with your camera. So skylines are very popular to shoot. This is a skyline, a panorama I took of Boston with the Sakim Bridge on the right, and I have a crescent moon and Venus setting over it. Here's another view a little closer, and that is one of the examples where I took my long lens. It's actually a 500 millimeter lens, zooming in on the skyline of Boston with the Tobin Bridge going into the city and right between the Sakim pillars. So pretty neat view there. This is San Diego, California from Coronado. This is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where two rivers are joining into one. And this is Portland, Oregon, with some beautiful colors here in the water. And if you ever get to go to Singapore, that is a night photographer's heaven. I tell you, it is an amazing city with a laser light show every night. That's indicated on the right. It's a really beautiful place. But New York City is not shabby either. If you go there, especially on a cloudy night when all of the lights from the city are reflecting on the clouds above it. So that's really cool too. Shot from New Jersey. And once you get into the city, you can focus on architecture, find some really cool buildings like this one here in Boston Seaport. Here is the New York High Line where you can walk around as a pedestrian area. And on that night, I only had a fisheye with me, and my goal was no straight lines. And I think I succeeded with that. Here is the South Station in Boston with a really cool building behind it. That is Hartford, Connecticut, the Science Center. And that is a building being built in Chicago a couple of years or 3 years ago. And this is what I call the alien Buckeyes. That's the Kresge Library at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then I love shooting abandoned stuff. So anything crumbling, decaying, rusting, that is my thing to do. And this is an abandoned train station. And as you can see, the train tracks are not abandoned. The train is still going, but the train station is abandoned. You can see how it is slowly overgrowing. This is a building that I found which was completely burned out. It no longer exists, but I got there right on time to take a cool night photo of it. This is one of the many piers that are left over from decades ago in Boston. The Tobin Bridge is in the background, and somebody tried to set those wood planks on fire. So I light painted it a little bit in the foreground because it was all black and black, and it gives you a nice foreground, right? And here's an abandoned building in Fitchburg, a small town here in Massachusetts. Abandoned buildings have something very intriguing about them because they're completely dark. There's no light coming out. So they kind of look creepy from the outside, and I kind of like that. And you emphasize that with a little bit of grit on the facade. You can shoot people at night. Just make sure that you don't announce that on Facebook, because if you say something like, I'm going out to shoot some people tonight, that might be mistaken. But I had the opportunity to photograph a young lady here. My sister-in-law makes that dress. And I thought it's really cool in front of that fountain there. And it did look nice, but it was quite challenging because that young lady is 5'11" tall and standing in 6-inch high heels on soft grass. Try to make her stand still for 5 seconds. It's not possible. You can create some cool shadows with that and put yourself in the image. That is yours truly here. And you can hang out at train stations, wait for something to come rolling in and people standing still. That's always a nice contrast. Or you wait for that little child to come out of the fifth dimension down to Earth. That's also very cool, right? Or shoot some events. So it's something you can do. It's extra challenging because people move and you need sort of a short exposure, but it's dark. It's not something I do very often, but it is certainly something you can explore, right? It doesn't always have to be some kind of fancy place. Suburbia can look really good too. This is actually the end of the street right outside. So to the left here in the shadows, that's my driveway. And if you go a little further, that is my view out over the river that I live on. That's the Charles River, frozen over in the winter. Here's a steeple that I found in Pittsburgh again, a small town in Massachusetts. And when I was on my way home, I looked over my shoulder and I saw that bright tree there. So there is a really bright sodium vapor light right behind that tree, illuminating the tree from the back and then creating that beautiful reflection on the water. So I pulled over, I got out of my car, set my camera back up, and took that photo. And here is something where the train tracks go behind the corner, create a little bit of mystery, what's going on back there. Or you just walk along Cape Cod Canal. I liked the light over the bridge there, over the hill, with that single tree standing. So suburbia can work out quite nicely. And if you happen to get some fog, somebody mentioned the fog rolling in San Diego. We call that May gray and June gloom in the morning. But if you find it at night, it's a really cool thing because it diffuses the lights and makes it easier to shoot really bright lights. And you can include some car trails into that. And talking about the transformational character of night photography, this is the parking lot of a Stop and Shop grocery store. So it doesn't get any more mundane than this, but it actually looks kind of cool with the reflections on it, right? And this is upstate New York, another foggy night. And if you want to shoot after rain, we usually cannot shoot during a rain or during a snow because we take long exposures and you will always get droplets on the lens. So, but if you can go out to shoot after the rain stops, that is a really cool opportunity because everything is wet and you get these really bright reflections. So it makes it much easier to shoot that. Here's a pedestrian bridge in Providence, Rhode Island. And that is in front of Boston City Hall. There was a very shallow puddle, and I set my camera really, really low, right into the middle of the puddle, and shot that with a reflection. So it's very nice to do that. one of my projects and special things that I love to do, I mentioned it that's when I unpacked my long lens, the 200mm lens, is to shoot industrial settings. So industrial installations are something that you think of noisy, smelly, unpleasant, really busy. You want to drive by during the day. You don't want to be there. At night, they kind of transform into something that looks more like a tourist attraction, really, because you have all of these multicolored lights. You have the fumes coming out of the stacks, and that's, of course, all water vapor and nothing toxic. But it can look really, really nice. And if you use f11, f16, you get these beautiful starbursts around the bright lights. And you can also tell that what we perceive to be white light can actually be blue or green. The new LED lights have a green tint, and there are some LED lights that are bluish, and the sodium vapor lights are yellow. So you get that mix of colors, which is really beautiful. And again, only water vapor, right? And then, of course, landscapes, they transform at night as well. It gives you a much different view on those landscapes. And you can do that with the moon or without a moon. There was a little bit of a moon in the sky here. That is Zabriskie Point in Death Valley. And again, it's just 5 hours from you, so go for it. This is Cape Cod, just an oceanfront somewhere with the rocks in the foreground. The Garden of the Gods in Colorado with some star trails and clouds moving in. And it is a new dimension for your landscape photography, so to speak. So go for that. Now, one of the beautiful things and also one of the challenges at night is light sources, colors, and white balance. You have all sorts of different light sources in the city. You have LED lights, you have neon lights, you have sodium vapor lights, maybe mercury vapor lights, and they can all have different colors. So you have to deal with that. And this is something where I had an epiphany early on when I was starting to do night photography. I saw that boat here, the moon behind is disappearing behind the clouds. And I quickly set up my camera. I figured 1 minute, and I was spot on with that. And when I looked at the LCD screen, when the image was done, I wondered, why is that boat all yellow? What I saw was a brown wooden boat with white paint on it. And it comes out all yellow. So the moon and the clouds is neutral gray. That's what I wanted. But why was the boat so yellow? And then it dawned on me that there is a really bright yellow sodium vapor light right next to me. And that painted the boat yellow. What my brain saw was a brown boat with white paint, because we know how wood looks like, we know how white paint looks like, but as I mentioned early on, the camera just records what is actually there. And our perception is not only not optimized for colors, but the point is that our brain is filtering the information. And cameras don't filter information, they just record what's there. Our brain says this is a brown wooden boat with white paint, but the camera says, there is a yellow sodium vapor light there. So different lights have different colors, and we call that color temperature. So a high number, 10,000, we measure that in the Kelvin scale, which is a temperature scale. 10,000 Kelvin is really, really blue. 1,000 Kelvin is really, really warm. That's orange, almost red light. So they warm candlelight, for example. What we consider to be neutral white is somewhere around 5,500 Kelvin here. And we need to consider that because the white balance, the colors at night, they need to be balanced. So our white balance setting on the camera does just that. And it balances, corrects, or counters the color temperature. So if we have a really warm color temperature of 2000, we need to dial the white balance down to 2000, which means it makes the image cooler. And if we have a really cold white balance, 10,000, dialing the white balance to 10,000 makes the image warmer. And so it does the opposite of what the white balance, of what the color temperature actually is. And down here, you see the red, green, blue color space that our camera and our LCD mod is used to operate. And the white balance, the temperature range is this curve here that you see from 1500 or 1000 to 10,000. So 10,000 is blue, 1000, 2000 is really warm. And if that looks familiar, that's the two sliders in Lightroom and Camera Raw. You have a temperature slider, which goes from blue to orange, and you have a tint slider that goes from purple to green. And between those two sliders, you can go to any color in that spectrum that you want. So by using those two sliders in Lightroom or Camera Raw, we can dial in the correct neutral white balance. And here are the sliders. So why do we need to bother with white balance? You will often hear the argument, if you shoot raw format, don't bother, you can always correct for white balance. And there is a lot of truth to that if you don't have strong color lights. So during the day, if you shoot natural landscapes, you have a lot of latitude left to correct for white balance. The problem is in the city, you have artificial lights and they can trick you. So here's a photo that I took of that blue column. And it's an art installation, again, under a big bridge. And you see the concrete on the bridge is all yellow. And the blue isn't really blue, it's kind of purplish, right? But the histogram on my camera told me this is properly exposed. There is no highlight clipping, okay? And then when I went into post-processing, I corrected the white balance so that my concrete is actually gray and the blue is really blue. Look what happens. The blue is blowing out. And of course, the giveaway is that white strip that should have told me something is not right. But back then I was very inexperienced and I didn't notice that. I just trusted my histogram on the camera. And that is why we need to look at the RGB histogram to make sure that we are not clipping a single light, because that blue is gone. And raw file or not, I cannot recover that. And here's another example. When you look at the red, green, blue histogram, in this case, the red light is clipping, and that usually happens with those sodium vapor lights because they have a very strong red portion, and that can start to clip. But the green and the blue is actually slightly underexposed. So the average, the white histogram would show you just an average which looks properly exposed. And in reality, one of those colors is going out the window. And my advice is, look at your LCD screen. Does that look like the scenery I'm looking at, the scenery that I'm shooting? If your LCD screen is much too blue, you have to warm it up a little bit. If your LCD screen is totally yellow and brown, you have to cool it down a little bit. Make it look like the scenery you're looking at, okay? And then you are pretty close. All right. One aggravating fact is that white balance changes very dramatically during the civil and nautical twilight. And that's because the sun goes down below the horizon and it progressively cuts off the warm light, but the blue light keeps going over the horizon, and that makes everything blue in the atmosphere. That's the reason why we have these deeply blue skies during blue hour. That means that we have to keep cranking up the white balance all the way to 10,000. And then during nautical twilight, the sun goes away and the blue light also goes away. So now we have to dial it back down to a low Kelvin number, because now the heat radiation from Earth dominates the sky. And that is why we have to cool it down a little bit. It's tricky, but it can be managed, right? Now, in the city, all bets are off, because you can have all sorts of artificial lights, and you just have to make sure that your image looks a little bit like what you are looking at, all right? So different colors. Sometimes they're very desirable. This is, again, Singapore, and I have a really yellow art science museum. The hotel and gambling place is in blue, and the pedestrian bridge is in red. That's wonderful, wonderful play of colors that is very desired, right? Other times you have something not so desirable. So here's an old crumbling building that I wanted to photograph. On the left side is a really green neon light. On the right side is a really yellow sodium vapor light. So if I set my white balance on the left to get a white facade, the right side is totally purple. If I set my white balance to get a neutral white on the right, then I have this garishly green neon light on the left. And if I set my white balance somewhere in the middle, I get both. So what I do in these cases is I simply convert it to black and white because there is no desirable color information that I want to keep. And what I really wanted to show you is that crumbling facade and the rusting stairs and the graffiti. That was what caught my eye. And I'm just cutting out that color information that is only distracting. A few tips and tricks for you. I'll start with the high ISO preview. So remember that we chose to shoot at low ISO 100. We chose some kind of aperture for creative purposes, but we still haven't figured out what the actual exposure time is, right? And to remind you, one stop of light or one exposure value of light means twice the brightness or half the brightness. So if I go from 1 minute to 2 minutes, I get twice the brightness. If I go from 1 minute to 30 seconds, I get half the brightness. Likewise, if I go from ISO 100 to 200, it becomes twice as bright. ISO 100 to ISO 50 is half as bright. And I can use that to trade each other off with the aperture that I chose. And the thing is that 1 minute at ISO 100 is the same brightness as 1 second at ISO 6400. So if we go from ISO 100 to 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, that's 6 stops of exposure, right? And likewise, that makes 1 minute, 60 seconds goes to 30 seconds, 15, 8, 4, 2, 1 second. So 1 second at 6400 ISO is the same brightness as 1 minute at ISO 100. So what we're going to do to figure out exposure time is we're setting the camera temporarily to ISO 6400, and then we're going to figure out how many seconds do I need for the proper exposure. And the proper exposure means we want to stretch that histogram out all the way without clipping too many highlights. And that is trial and error. So start with 1 second. It's too dark. Double it. 2 seconds. Still too dark. Double it again, 4 seconds, and now it's a little too bright. So 3 seconds would have been the proper exposure. And that just took you 7 to 10 seconds to figure out instead of 7 or 10 minutes, right? So it's a very quick way of figuring out your exposure time. So 3 seconds at 6400 ISO. Now you go back to ISO 100, and those 3 seconds becomes 3 minutes. Cool trick. Here's an example. This is the scenery I wanted to shoot, and I chose f16 as my aperture because I wanted everything sharp from foreground to background, but also because I wanted those nice starbursts around the bright lights, and f11, f16 gives you those. At 6400 ISO, the image is noisy as hell. Doesn't matter. All you want to do is figure out that histogram. And there are some clipping highlights, like up here in that construction zone here and the really bright lights, and I sacrificed those. And what I wanted to shoot is the reflections here on the water. That is the beautiful highlights, and they are not clipping. So 2 seconds gave me this exposure with the histogram stretched all the way out to the right. Now I go back from ISO 6400 to ISO 100, and the 2 seconds becomes 2 minutes. And this is the result. Super smooth water, like a mirror finish. The clouds are moving in the sky. I get those nice starbursts. I do a little bit of cropping and a little bit of clarity. And this is my end result. Really smooth, beautiful night photo. And it took me only about 5 or 10 seconds to figure out what that exposure time is, right? Now, don't forget to turn your ISO back down to 100. That's important because if you shoot 2 or 3 or 4 minutes at ISO 6400, it'll look like this, right? And there are two, this is how it was supposed to look. And I forgot to turn the ISO down to 100. I was shooting 8 minutes at 6400 ISO. And there are 2 reactions to this. There's a physical reaction and there's a mental reaction. The mental reaction is when you come back to your camera and you look at that and say, what is wrong with my camera? And then the physical reaction is, you idiot, you forgot the ISO. All right. There you go. And one thing, if you do this playoff between ISO and exposure time, you have to keep doubling the time, you have to keep halving the ISO and so on. Start thinking in full exposure stops. It makes things much easier. I do not bother with exposure times of 1 minute and 20 seconds or so. I go 1 minute or I go 2 minutes, and maybe I open the aperture up for half a stop to accommodate it or so. I go 1, 2, 4, 8, 15, 30, 60. That's easy for me in my mind. And likewise with the ISO 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, much easier to think about that, to do the math. Aperture is a little more tricky because those numbers are all odd, right? So you can, the way I drew it here is 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, it doubles 2. And 1.4, 2.8, 5.6, 11 doubles, but those are 2 stops at a time, right? So you just have to learn those numbers. 2.8 to 22 is usually the range of most lenses, right? So, and you can play with that. If you have ISO 100, f8 in 1 minute, and you try to keep the same brightness, if you change from f8 to f11, you get half the brightness because you're closing your aperture. That means your 1 minute needs to go to 2 minutes, right? If you go instead from ISO 100 to 200, then you go from 1 minute to 30 seconds because 200 ISO makes it twice as bright, and so on. So all of these settings are the same. And learn to think in full stops, ignore the odd numbers, makes it much easier at night. The second biggest tip for you after trying to figure out how your camera works at night is to use the RGB, the red, green, blue histogram. And that is the #1 indicator whether or not you exposed properly. Remember, if your LCD screen is too bright, it looks properly exposed, but it's really underexposed. If you look at the histogram, that will tell you exactly that you exposed properly, that you overexposed, or that you underexposed. And it's a really nice indicator. And I do that for every single photo. I look at it and, oh, this is a little underexposed. Let's do it again. Open the aperture up a little bit, or go twice as long, right? Now, one of the big trade-offs at night, and that is probably the biggest challenge you will encounter, is highlights. And that is why I told you to enable the highlight clipping indicator. That's what I call the blinkies, right? If you have a few pixels blinking, that's fine. You can always recover from that because what you see on the LCD screen is actually a JPEG. It's not the RAW file. So if you load that into your software, you can always recover from a few pixels blinking. But if you have this much highlight blinking, that means this is all blown out. This is purely white, and there is no way of recovering that. So you have to dial your exposure back a little bit, make sure that it is not clipping as much, right? That's, again, where it comes into shoot in RAW format because you have much more latitude in recovering highlights. And that's where you use the histogram to make sure that you are not having any pixels crawling up the right edge, which means you're clipping the highlights, right? And the red, green, blue histogram is especially helpful because it shows you that a single color is clipping. In this case, it's probably the blue, not the red. So here's an example, and I distinguish between sacrificial highlights and desired highlights. So here is a street scenery. I was intrigued by all of those marquees. I zoomed in to compress the view a little bit. And if you look at the highlight clipping indicator, you notice that the street lights are clipping and the car lights are clipping. But what I not wanted to clip are all of those marquees, and I was successful. So there's a lot of information in there, but I pushed the exposure as much as I could. So I also get a little bit of information in the shadows that are not illuminated, right? And those street lights and the car lights, that is what I call sacrificial highlights. They will always clip because they're so bright. And so I sacrifice them. And what I call a desired highlight are the marquees. And here's another example. This is a beautiful blue illuminated bridge with the yellow street lights reflecting in the water. And there are some lights clipping, like the marquee here, this thing over there on the left, and some lights here and here. And that is what I call the sacrificial highlights. They don't contribute much to the image. What makes the image is the blue bridge and those golden reflections on the water. And that is what you have to expose for. And if you look closely, you can also see that the lights in the center of those reflections, that's where it starts to clip. And if you cannot recover those, it actually looks really ugly. So you need to make sure that you expose for those properly. Here are a few examples, just 3 images that I shot where I was exposing properly for the highlights. This is a drawbridge, and I was exposing for this entrance up here. This is a sacrificial highlight, but I wanted to make sure that this doesn't clip and the reflections don't clip. In post-processing, I just did a little bit of contrast, pushed the shadows, nothing much. That's the end result. But you can see that I have definition here in that bright part. A more extreme example is this one here. That's a building, and just about everything is underexposed because those lights are really bright. And I exposed for the brightest part, which is right here in the middle, and made sure that this is not clipping. So looking at the histogram shows me I stretched this all the way out, but there's no highlight clipping. There's no pixel crawling up the right edge, right? Now, what you do in post-processing with that is, the first thing is you reduce the highlights, and now everything is underexposed. And then you push the exposure slider and you bring both the highlights and the shadows back, and maybe push the shadows a little bit on top. And that is how you get here. And you can see that nothing is clipping here in this really, really bright part, which on the camera looked like it's almost clipping, but it's not. I was able to recover that. This is not an HDR. This is a single image. I just exposed for the highlights and then pushed the shadows accordingly. And the last example is the iconic view of Boston Harbor. And again, what I'm exposing for is this arch here and that marquee up there. And I wasn't interested in the right part. I cropped that off, corrected the white balance a little bit, and here's the end result. And again, all of the detail can be seen here. There's nothing clipping. The reflections on the water are beautiful. That's what you need to look for. Last tip I have for you is focusing at night. I told you that autofocus doesn't work, so how are you supposed to work? If there are lights, street lights, car lights, you can focus on those pretty easily. If you're out, you have the moon and the Jupiter maybe in the sky, you can easily focus on that. In the city, you might even be able to autofocus, but I don't recommend it. I recommend to do it manually. What I do is I go into light view, and then I put the cursor somewhere where I have a contrast between light and dark. So I chose the frame here between the illuminated window and the black shutters. You could also choose the bright sky and the forest highlight here. Either one works. And then you use the plus minus buttons, the zoom buttons, and zoom in on that. It's noisy as hell, but you can easily tell which one is sharp and which one is not. So you manually focus, basically go back and forth and see where it's the sharpest. And when you're there, zoom back out, get out of live view, and take your photo. That is the easiest way to do it. And if you don't have any light, you're in a darker area, take a flashlight and just shine your flashlight at that point where you want to focus. It's very easy to do. If you don't have any light, no nearby object, again, take the flashlight. And if you do star trails, star points, Milky Way, you absolutely have to focus on the stars. Otherwise, they look really funky. So just choose the brightest star in the sky, or maybe the moon, and focus on that, and you will be okay. And if you have none of that because it's cloudy, then and you forgot your flashlight at home, then you can take sample shots. You know, go to infinity, take a shot, a little left of infinity, second shot, a little right of infinity, a third shot, and then you zoom in and compare them and see which one is the sharpest, and you go with that. Now, I talked about the element of time. Because we are taking long exposures, we are recording time. Everybody has done this, right? Shooting for a waterfall during the day, maybe at a half second. Ooh, long exposure. And if you do that at night, it becomes really interesting. And the longer you expose, the smoother the water gets. So here is a 1 second exposure, very ripply water. 2 seconds, 4 seconds. 8 seconds, and notice how I just double the numbers, right? 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute, and 2 minutes. So the longer you expose, the smoother the water gets, and the more stark these shadows become on the water as well. they kind of disappear in the ripples, right? So you want to maximize that. And this was a windy night, actually. So I'm not getting that mirror finish on the water, but it was quite windy. So you can't completely eliminate that motion, but it gets more and more smooth. And in some cases, you can record the effect of time, something that you don't see with your naked eye, and that is this little swirl here where the water goes in circles. So you create a little swirl, and sometimes you have a leaf on top of the water, and that creates the streak. It's a beautiful effect. And here is another very smooth water with a light station down in the island. Now, recording time, car trails. I showed you this image before. This is Atlanta, Georgia. When the red lights are the tail lights, that's the cars going into the city, and the headlights, the bright white lights coming out of the city. And you can, it's a nice shot. I saw somebody taking this shot during the day, and I thought that might look really good at night. And I found where that bridge is and put myself there and recorded it. Here is a LED illuminated bridge in Boston, and I timed it for a taxi that drove by with some kind of advertisement on top. That's the blue streak that you see going through the photo. Very dynamic element, kind of leads you into the far, right? And here is a bridge going in and out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, with the cars going in and out. And a little bit of serendipity. I set the camera up very low here because the moon looked very nice behind the clouds, and it reflected very nicely on the tar here. I wanted to record that, and when I was starting my exposure, a car came by with red taillights going by, so that added to the composition, and I wasn't planning on it. So serendipity sometimes works in your favor. And you can capture motion in terms of cloud movement. And clouds go different ways. So in this case, the clouds are going sideways, which is more of a serene view. In other cases, the clouds don't move very much, like this one here. Or if you are shooting into the wind or with the wind, then the cloud streaks are coming right at you. And that makes the image very dynamic because you see that movement coming right at you, right? Now, the question is, I figured out my exposure time at ISO 100 and f8. How long do I expose? Because I can get to f5.6 and half the exposure time, or I can go to f11 and double the exposure time, all with the same brightness, right? And the answer is, it depends a little bit. So here's an example where I was shooting a bridge. That's the George Washington Bridge in New York going into New Jersey. And the clouds were moving, and I was figuring out, so how do the clouds look if I shoot 3 seconds, 6, 10, 20, 40, 80, 160, 320 seconds? And it depends on what do you like best, and what do you think is the best effect here. So I picked 3 seconds, 40 seconds, and 2 minutes, or 4 minutes. And on the left side, I think the clouds are too puffy. I don't like that. On the right side, the clouds are all smeared into one big white sheet. I don't like that either. So the middle one, the 40 seconds, was the best time for this, actually, because I like how these shadows and the clouds still show, but it's a very smooth cloud movement, right? So if you're in doubt, take a few photos, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, and expose and compensate for that either with aperture or ISO so that you get the same brightness of the image, of course, right? Here's another example, emissions from some industrial plant across the water there. This is a 1 minute image where the fumes diffuse nicely and go with the wind. That's, again, recording time, right? This is 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 8 seconds, 4 seconds. So which one is the best? The 4 seconds gives you more of an image as you see it in real time. The 60 seconds smooths everything out and gives it a bit of an otherworldly look, right? Which one do you like best? Again, take a few photos and notice how the brightness of these images is the same. And what I did here was I'm basically compensating with ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. And the times go from 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 15, 30, 60 seconds, right? All right. Now you can record time by recording star trails, and that even works in the city. So all you have to do is look up really. Make sure that you zoom past the bright streetlights. And if you can do that, you can focus on the stars and you can do star trails in the city. And it's something that rarely anybody does because we don't typically look up into the sky in the city, right? We look around us, what's there, and oh yeah, there's a party and here's a street gambler. Looking up is really cool. And if you wonder why I shoot these elevated platforms or bucket lifts, that's just a hobby of mine. I like those. And you can even do that in New York City. This is Queens, New York, and you see the star trails here very brightly. But you can also see how they fade out towards the horizon. That's because the city gets brighter and brighter, right? And I always say if you can do star trails over Manhattan, you can do them anywhere in the world because that's just about the brightest place you can be. I'm on the other side of the water. I chose f11 as my aperture because I wanted the foreground to be in focus and the background. And I took 2-minute photos and that worked. All right. Let's talk a little bit about composition. And there is really a lot of familiar stuff at night. Everything you have learned about composition, the rule of thirds, leading lines, repeating patterns, symmetry, negative space, all of that still applies. And you see one element, one example for each of those rules here. There are two things that are new at night. One is that you have bright lights and you have to make sure that they are not right at the edge. So here's an example. I wanted to shoot the blue scenery there, and there's the super bright yellow sodium vapor light out. So instead of looking at the beautiful blue scenery, your eye goes right out the frame into that orange, right? So you want to avoid that. In this case, I just ended up cropping it out, and now you can focus on the beautiful scenery with all of the stacks going up into the sky. That is what I wanted to show you, right? And the other thing is, as I just showed you, the clouds, and you can make that part of your composition. Give it a more serene view by having the clouds go sideways, or a more dynamic view with the clouds coming right at you. Once you get home, you're gonna upload your photos and you're going to do some editing. And night photos always need some editing. First of all, many of those come out flat right out of camera, and others come out with a very dynamic range. Super bright lights and really underexposed shadows, as I showed you. So you always have to do something to those images to make them look their best. And of course, you always want to add your own touch to it. So here's an example where I'm shooting a scenery. What intrigued me were those beams going into the sky. We call them crepuscular rays. And I'm already zoomed into 70 millimeters. That's as far as my lens was going. So I couldn't eliminate that super bright light at the edge. And I couldn't eliminate a little bit of the rail that I caught on the bottom. But I was envisioning that I'm going to crop both of those out. So my camera told me this is properly exposed, except for that one sacrificial highlight. This part here is properly exposed, and that's important, right? And then once I was done editing, I cropped out the bright light, I cropped out the rail on the bottom, and this is the end result. Nice rule of thirds. The bright light is here on the 1/3 line, right? You have 1/3 of water and 2/3 of rest, and these really interesting rays coming out. Here's another example, an image that came out rather flat looking. I actually light painted the foreground to emphasize those tire tracks, and you don't even notice that in this image. So what I did was I added a lot of contrast to that, cooled it down a little bit, and that's the end result. So now you see my light painting on the ground and those clouds that are coming right at me because I'm shooting into the wind, nicely emphasized by those two conveyor belts, right? That's very flat out of camera and nicely contrasty after editing. And another thing I mentioned earlier is white balance. If you are on daylight or sunny white balance, everything will come out like this, yellow-brown. And if you are shooting on outer white balance, everything will be really blue. And how it should really look like is like this, a little bit of balance. There are some warm tones and blue tones. The sky is bluish. So if you see this on the LCD screen, you know that you need to cool it down a little bit. And if you see this on your LCD screen, you know that you have to warm it up a little bit, right? So make the LCD screen look like the scenery in front of you. And then the second most common mistake I see when people start out night photography is under or overexposure. So this is an example that is clearly underexposed. If you look at the histogram, you see there's no information here on the right side. So this is 2-3 stops underexposed. So just take the image again and make it more bright. And now you see the histogram is nicely stretched out. And there are a few highlights clipping, and that's the sacrificial highlights, the speed lights, right? We let those clip. What we don't want to let clip is the reflections here in the water and those nice colored lights on in the city. And then if you overdo it, this is how it looks after editing, basically, with a little bit of contrast. If you overdo it, it looks like this, and that is clearly overexposed, right? You see everything is clipping, including those reflections on the water. Just close down the aperture a little bit and do it again. So we are getting to the end. If you can remember 4 things from this talk, one is shoot at low ISO, and that means somewhere around 100. Could be 200, could be 50, maybe 400, but no higher than that. And use your high ISO preview. Go to 6400 ISO. How many seconds do I need for the proper exposure? And then the seconds becomes minutes if you go back to ISO 100. And try to maximize your exposure time. Capture the element of time. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes is a good range to be at, right? Use your RGB histogram. Very important because it gives you a view whether or not you exposed properly, and it shows you if you have a white balance problem, and it shows you if you are clipping a single color. So that is very important. And use the Kelvin scale, white balance, and keep adjusting that, especially during civil and nautical twilight, because the white balance keeps changing, right? Look at your LCD screen. Does that look like the scenery I'm watching and I'm trying to shoot? And then rediscover the world at night. Go to places that you think might be very mundane during the day, and they might just transform into something at night. Here I am in an abandoned building, Fort Worth, Texas. I found this beautiful window with a broken glass and the skyline of Fort Worth in the back. So the door was open. I was not trespassing. There was no trespassing sign, but I was lucky to get inside there. All right. Some resources for you. If you want to have a book about night photography and a little bit of light painting, Lance Kymick, he wrote this book. It's a wonderful book. It's the best one on the market. And I don't say that because he was my teacher. It is really the best book out there. Gabe Biederman, Tim Cooper, who wrote one from night photography, from snapshots to great shots. It's a little more simplistic, but doesn't go as much into depth. And then I have speaker notes. If you're interested, you can download them from my website. It's Urban Night Photography. It's very similar to what I talked about tonight. Covers just about everything you heard tonight. And go on social media. So Instagram, 500 pics, Flickr, whatever you use, you can find a lot of inspiration by searching for night photography. And how do you get out to do workshops? This is not relevant to you because it's in the Boston area. That's my meetup group, but there are actually meetup groups out west, so you might just find one. Your camera club might organize some events, and you can request to do a night photo event. Maybe you have a person who knows night photography a little better, and you can use them as a guide. And then there are professionally organized workshops. National Parks at Night, the 5 guys, they specialize in organizing night photo workshops and tours. They go into the national parks with a permit, and they do international tours. Really beautiful. It's not cheap, but very worth it. I do one-on-one and small group workshops as well. And you can find me online in a lot of different places. And if you can't remember all of those links, just remember one of them, linktree/Jurgen Lobert. and that is linktr.ee/jmlobert, and you get everything on the left side. If you go to, where is it, Photoblog, Instagram, here's the website. And if you go to my website, it's actually jmlobert.com. On the bottom, you find an educational resources link, and that's where you find the speaker notes. And I just want to highlight one of those links. That's my Patreon channel. Patreon is a crowdfunding site where you can learn a lot by supporting me at the same time. And you can support me for as little as $2. And by now you can tap into more than 250 articles that I wrote. 80% of that is night photography centric. There's a lot of long exposures, infrared photography, but also a lot of equipment reviews and editing techniques in Lightroom and Camera Raw and Photoshop. So a lot of information there, and I would love it if I saw a few of you join that channel. And with that, I thank you for listening, and this is now a good time. Oh, look, more bucket lifts. This is a good time to ask your questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Jurgen. This is wonderful. Just what I hoped for.
I have a
Okay.
question with regard to your explanation of white balance and Kelvin. Am I understanding correctly, or maybe you can word it again, when you adjust your white balance, say you're shooting at night, which to the eye is a cooler temperature, are you saying when you adjust it to a warmer temperature, that neutralizes the white balance to make it neutral? So if I were,
as the name says, the white balance balances the actual color temperature. So at first, during civil and nautical twilight, the atmosphere gets really cool because
Yes.
of the blue light. So we have to crank up the white balance to make it warmer. Then it drops back down, and when the sun is completely gone, the heat from the earth warms up the atmosphere. So we have to cool it down and go to lower temperature settings.
so you indicated that one could look at the LCD to kind of get a sense, the color histogram of where your balance is. But at night, say you don't have a lot of light, how do you balance that out? Do you want to get like even reds with even blues with even greens?
Well, there is not much light for your eyes, but there is enough light for the camera. And remember, my advice is to stretch that histogram out all the way. And in many cases, your image will look more like an underexposed afternoon. It's too bright for what we consider to be nighttime. But that's good because you're utilizing the whole dynamic range of the camera. That's the best possible quality. And what you do with that image that looks like an underexposed afternoon, in post-processing, you just reduce the exposure a little bit and make it look like nighttime again. So you're taking all of that information, you just compress it into a smaller space. You're not losing anything. If you underexpose by filling that histogram only halfway, now you're losing thousands of light levels. So you're creating a lot of noise. If you stretch that out a little bit, it will be really, really noisy. So it's good to stretch that histogram. And if you do that, that image will be bright enough for you to see the color. If that is white, or if it's blue, or if it's yellow, right? It will give you enough information to see that. And if you follow that tip of doing the high ISO preview at 6400 ISO, 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, you get a really bright image, and you can tell from that alone what your white balance is. And that takes you just a few seconds. And then you adjust your white balance, you go to ISO 100, take your 3-minute shot, and it'll be spot on.
Thank you. I've never heard of white balance explained quite like that, and that's a really nice way of looking at it.
Beautiful images, Jurgen.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to your spreading of the histogram. Are you talking about that in post-processing, or are you talking about that some way while you're taking the picture?
In camera, you want to maximize the exposure as much as you can.
So you're talking about shooting to the right without blowing out any of the red, green, or blue.
Exactly. You might blow out the sacrificial highlights, the street lamps, right? They call up the right edge, but you don't want to blow out those beautiful reflections, whatever catches your eye, really. What makes the image, you want to expose to that. But you do want to expose to the right as much as you can. And as I mentioned, if it looks a little too bright for nighttime, you just reduce the exposure in post-processing, make it look like night again.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay,
So do you never shoot HDR? Do you not shoot multiple exposures?
I do, yes. If I have very extreme settings, for example, we have Boston has 3 bridges now that they illuminate at night with changing color LEDs, and unfortunately, they're all way too bright. So there's a spot that is just way too bright. If you expose for that, and you don't want to blow out the pillar of the bridge, if you expose for that, the rest is hopelessly underexposed. So you have to do HDR for those cases. That's for very extreme brightness differences. I do HDR.
And then one other question. I like to shoot night photography as well, but one thing I've always run into problems with is trying to get the moon properly exposed and then the background. Do you mix exposures?
Yeah, so that's a difficult thing to do because the moon is so bright, right? And in most cases, you cannot do that. You can get the moon and the ambient properly exposed when the moon is just coming over the horizon because it's really red, much less bright than when it's up high. So that is what we often do. Like tomorrow night, we go out to shoot the full moon rising, and we shoot that in front of some interesting object or so. You can get the ambient and the moon properly exposed if you are no later than 30 minutes past sunset. Once you get past that, the dynamic range is too bright. You cannot possibly get ambient and the moon properly exposed. So what I do then is I maybe zoom in on the moon, take a nice photo of the moon at f11 and 1/350th of a second, and take another shot of the landscape at 4 minutes in ISO 100 or something at 5.6, and then compose the moon into the landscape. But the image actually still looks very intriguing if you expose for the landscape. Make sure that the moon doesn't bloom. So the moon itself, the disk will blow out because it's too bright. Just make sure that that brightness doesn't bloom too much and blows out all of the clouds around it. So choose the exposure properly so that the moon clips only a little bit, but you get a nice nicely exposed landscape. And that still looks very intriguing because we know that's the moon. Our mind makes up for that. So we don't have to see the craters on the moon, but it shows you the difference between digital cameras, which have about 14 exposure stops of dynamic range, and the human eye, which has about 20 stops of exposure latitude. So we are still way behind the technology compared to the human eye.
Well, thank you. My goodness.
yeah, this has been fabulous.
Absolutely.
Lot to chew on. I'm looking forward to downloading your notes.
Yeah, how do we do that again? How do we get to your notes there?
I can send Lorinda the link and she can broadcast it.
That
I'll
would be wonderful.
be happy to do that.
That'd be
And
Well,
also
awesome.
you recorded it, right?
Yes, Fern recorded it and he's going to let us know where it ends up on YouTube.
I have one more question, if you can hear me.
Yes?
Yeah.
So as you mentioned, the way our eyes work is we go from daylight to night. We switch from our cones to our rods, whereas our camera doesn't, our sensor doesn't. do you know of any attempts to capture images on a camera which look like they do to our eyes? That is what our eyes actually see, not what the camera sensor sees.
Are you asking about me trying to get a photo that looks like what I see in the real world?
Yes.
You can do that, and I'm actually in the process of writing an article about it. But if you look at those photos, they will look underexposed, and they will not look intriguing at all. So when we see night photos, they're all boosted. They're all much brighter than what our eyes see. It's an interesting psychological effect, really. If we see the night scenery, we might enjoy it. If we take a photo, we want that photo to show more detail. So whatever you see as a published night photo is going to be much brighter than what you actually see with your eyes.
Yeah.
Less saturation.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really informative. Great presentation.
Yes.
Yes, very
Yes.
illuminating. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Appreciate all your tips.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And
Have a
Jurgen,
good night.
I don't
Yes.
think I received your address for sending you the honorarium.